So our next speaker is Alison Karp, who comes to us from Pennsylvania State University, and she works with Kate Freeman there. She did her undergraduate work at Washington University in St. Louis and in biology and environmental geology, earth sciences, which set her up very nicely for her interests in bridging biology and geology and looking at deep time ecological interactions in deep time. And she specializes in a group of compounds called compound-specific biomarkers and how those are reflecting the biological processes in different biomes, and understanding how those biomes and how different ecological processes in those biomes have evolved in deep time. I'm allowed to say deep time. And so she's worked in a number of different geographic areas, from spanning the Miocene to recent, and looking at some modern applications. And so I'm interested to see what she's going to be telling us about. So please.
Well, thank you, Katie, for that introduction, and thank you for having me here to speak today. I'm really excited to be sharing with you some of my recent work trying to constrain fire feedbacks during the C4 Grassland Expansion in the late Miocene. And the order of this is great, because you guys have already heard a little bit about C4 Grassland Expansion and C3 grasses and C4 grasses today, so I get to build on that nice foundation that we have this morning. But one of the things I'm particularly interested in studying in the geologic record is the process of fire. So I'm going to start my talk there. So why do we actually care about wildfires? So firstly, from a societal perspective, wildfire has a massive cost, both in property damage and human life. And this is a picture from the Napa Valley fires in 2017 of a winery burning. So understanding what causes extreme fire events and how to potentially predict and mitigate them is really important to economic planning for a lot of communities in the US and around the world. From an Earth systems perspective, biomass combustion of wildfires actually represents an important carbon flux with the atmosphere from the terrestrial biome. The combustion process releases carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, but it also stimulates the biomes in soils and nitrogen production in soils, and potentially can act as a sink as well. So understanding these different fluxes helps us to better constrain the terrestrial carbon cycle and put more accurate numbers into some of these models. And this is a figure showing the global emissions from wildfires from 2005 to 2015. And finally, from an ecologist perspective, fire provides a really important ecosystem service, and it's an essential character to a lot of different types of ecosystems across the globe. And specifically in open grassland ecosystems, like this African ecosystem I'm showing here, frequent fires are a characteristic to help maintain healthy biomes. So I'm really going to be focusing on this ecological perspective and this perspective of fire and its relationship and importance in grassland ecosystems today. So I think about things in the paleoecological context, but I think it's really important to start with a modern understanding of grasslands and fire. So this is a global dynamic vegetation model showing the modern distributions of plant functional types across the Earth's surface. And I really want you to put your focus on the yellow and the orange colors, which represent the distributions of the world's grasslands. The yellow represents grasses that use the C3 photosynthetic pathway, and the orange represents grasses that use the C4 photosynthetic pathway. And this is a little bit of review from earlier today, but C4 plants and C3 plants fix carbon using different mechanisms, and these different fixation pathways actually favor C4 plants over C3 plants under certain environmental conditions. And this has to do with the efficiency that they're able to fix carbon. So C4 plants do really well in low CO2, high light, arid, high growing temperature conditions. And these are just some pictures showing how different these type of ecosystems look across the globe. There's very variable functional forms. And in addition to the environmental factors that promote these pathways over each other, there's also a differential isotope fractionation between the C3 and the C4 pathways based on both structural and enzymatic differences in the pathways. And this is a repeat of that figure you've seen a bunch of times today, where you see that the C3 plants are less enriched, are depleted in the heavier isotope, while C4 plants are more relatively enriched, and that there's this 10 to 12 per mil offset between the two distributions, which is useful because we can use this to identify plants that use these different pathways in the modern, and then also identify C3 and C4 communities in a paleo context as well. So moving back to this plant functional type map, Bill Bond and his colleagues were really interested in not only thinking about how these different environmental characteristics might control the distributions of these plant functional types across the Earth's surface, but how other factors besides just these basic metabolic preferences might control the distribution of these types. So what they did is they took their global dynamic vegetation model and they turned off fire. They took all the fire processes out of that model, and what they found is that it no longer matched modern observations. There was a major restriction of C4 subtropical grasslands in their geographic distribution model. And what they concluded is that fire is a really essential process to maintaining these open subtropical ecosystems. And not just fire itself per se, but if we zoom in even a little bit more, the particular fire regime found in these ecosystems is unique in itself. And this is a figure showing the distribution of the world's pyromes, or global fire regimes. And you can see that these frequent fire regimes coincide in the spaces where we find these C4 subtropical grasslands. And so it's not just burning, but it's this frequent burning that really seems to coincide geographically with these C4 subtropical spaces. And we can think about this from a geographic perspective, but we can also think about it from this ecological framework that's called the Fire Boomerang, which I really like. It was put forward in a review by a group out of Australia a couple years ago, which is aptly named. And it's basically a way of just visualizing how ecosystems fall based on their fire frequencies and then abiotic variables that control, that have controls on both the fire and the ecology. So precipitation and temperature, seasonality moves towards the center of the axis, so less seasonal to more seasonal, and then lightning ignitions. And what we can see is that the C4 system is kind of situated at the apex of this boomerang, where you're in a highly seasonal system and you have high frequency fires in these open subtropical systems. So we have these observations of where we see these co-occurring, but we can also explain these relationships mechanistically as well. So this is a feedback diagram thinking about how these different variables interact in these modern systems. So in order for grasses to compete, they need to not be shaded by a large overstory of trees. So you need to clear away shade and allow them to start to proliferate on the landscape. So you need some type of disturbance. In this case, we're using fire. Fire disturbs the system. Grasses have the ability to grow, to rapidly generate a lot of biomass. They might invade. That rapidly generated biomass also would promote more seasonal burning because you have more biomass available to burn. In addition, if you add seasonality or seasonal drought into this, if you grow a lot of biomass in a very wet season and then dry it out extensively in a dry season, you increase your annual fire potential as well. So these two positive feedback loops really help promote and maintain these open systems in the modern. And this is a very well-studied and observed relationship. But fire processes also operate on a bunch of different spatial and temporal scales. So you can go all the way down to the chemical process of combustion and what you need to produce a flame, all the way up to thinking about these global pyromes, right? So the distribution of these regimes across a geographic space. But I'm a paleoecologist, so I think about these processes on a deep time scale. So I'm like almost falling off this diagram when it comes to the timescales I talk about. I think about things on long-term evolutionary timescales. And what this means, one, is that unfortunately, the resolution that we can ask some of these fire-based questions on is really restricted, one, by the nature of the rock record, but also by the types of tools that we can use to say something about fire. So I'm not going to be talking to you about fire return intervals or anything else like that today. I'm going to be talking to you about general long-term shifts in fire regimes, rather than quantitative variables that someone who's measuring fire on a decadal to maybe centennial scale might be able to quantify with the tools they have at their disposal. So the Zackos curve was shown earlier today, so that's great for context. But when we think about the relationships between fire and grasslands and how that's changed through geologic history, I think that the best place to start is when C4 grassland ecosystems first expanded in geologic time. And so to put that in a paleoclimate context, the Zackos curve really is a great place to start because, like Catherine said this morning, this oxygen isotope record from benthic forams reflects the global ocean temperature and global ice volume throughout the last 65 million years. And you can see that it has not been static during this time. So to place grassland expansion on top of the context of the Zackos curve, it's occurring at this time where we have general global cooling. Also, there's not currently consensus on what carbon dioxide is doing at this time, but the current consensus is that we think it's decreasing, but it's still really poorly constrained. But that's generally the background of what's going on from a global climate perspective. The other thing I want to point out about grassland expansion is that it doesn't occur simultaneously. It's this long, drawn out, about 7 million year process of these ecosystems expanding across the globe. And if you zoom in even more on that, we can see that it doesn't happen in the same time in every continent either. So this is a really great summary figure from the Edwards 2010 review with time on the x-axis and then the percentage of C4 grasses on the y-axis, and that's reconstructed from paleosol carbonates for the with the solid color, and then tooth enamel isotope values with the dotted color. And then this is just thinking about opening of landscapes, and that's from a bunch of different proxies. What you can see is that depending on what continent you're talking about, the time and character of the expansion is very, very different. And what this observation has led the community to do is to shift our thinking a little bit from thinking about global drivers for grassland expansion, like changes in temperature or CO2, to potentially more regionalized factors, and how these different regional factors might be able to explain the asynchrony that we see in the grassland expansion. And so out of that, of course, came the fire hypothesis for grassland expansion, which was proposed by John Keeley and Phil Rundle back in the early 2000s. And what they proposed was that a change in seasonality would have increased annual fire potential, allowed allowed fire to clear space for grasses, allowed grasses to proliferate, and then enter into this positive feedback cycle where grasses promote frequent fires and maintain themselves. And this is based on the same modern ecological observations that I went through earlier. And it makes a lot of sense, both in the context of what we understand about grasslands today and through what we see from modeling data. And most people agree that this is probably a really important component of C4 grassland expansion in the Miocene, but there's actually very few studies that have tried to explicitly test it. This is probably one of the more understudied drivers of grassland expansion compared to other things like general hydrology, temperature, or CO2. So there's a few studies that have measured distal marine charcoal or black carbon records to try to get at this fire question. And see how fire is related to the expansion of these ecosystems. There's almost no studies that do it at the landscape scale. So really, the question that I'm asking is, do we find actual evidence for late Miocene fire ships at this level where things are actually burning on the landscape? And I'm going to be focusing in on the grassland expansion in South Asia. And like Catherine said this morning, this is the first place that C4 grassland expansion was quantified, and it's a really great place to work because it has a really rich historical record. And what I'm going to be doing with this talk today is really focusing on this overriding question: is, do we have proxy evidence to support this fire feedback hypothesis in the late Miocene? Can we explicitly test this using paleoenvironmental proxies? And to do this, like I said, I'm going to be working with Paleosol sediments from the Potwar Plateau in Pakistan. These sediments span a 14 million year to 2 million year time span, which captures the Grassland Expansion event in this record. And like I said before, this area has been really very, very well studied. So Jay Quaid and Turi Serling have measured the carbon and oxygen isotopes in Paleosol carbonates from this same area. And the oxygen isotopes provide a nice record of paleo hydrologic change. My advisor, Kate Freeman, measured carbon isotopes in the organics in these sediments 20 years ago now, actually. And so there's a lot of potential records for using, potential background information for using this as a good test for fire. And how am I going to get at that? So I am going to be using molecular proxies to try to get at vegetation change and changes in fire over time. So leaf waxes are molecules that are derived from the surface of plant leaves, and these are PAHs, or polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, which are produced through burning. So I'm the only person who's using compound-specific stuff today, so I thought I would espouse a little bit about why using molecular proxies is really very useful for answering paleoecological questions. So these compounds retain source-specific information about both the environmental and ecological conditions that they were grown under in deep time. And so I think that using these is a really important way to get at both changes in vegetation and fire. So these biomarkers reflect the same isotopic differentiation between C3 and C4 plants that we see in bulk plant material. So we can use their isotopes to get at these changes in the record. So moving into some of my, my paleoecological data, this is the oxygen isotope record from Jay and Turi's work, which shows an isotopic enrichment in the oxygen that has been interpreted as an increase in summer monsoon seasonality. And this is a record of the carbon isotopes from the leaf waxes, which also show an enrichment, which is indicating a transition to C4 grasses on the landscape. This is a record from a marker of conifers called retine. And what we see with this record is that there seems to be a general decrease in conifers on the landscape before we get into this isotopically enriched space. So that's indicating that there's some type of vegetation shift potentially occurring before C4 plants expand. So this is a record showing the concentrations of PAHs relative to a plant biomarker, and this is on a log scale. And first of all, you can see this is incredibly variable, which is not unexpected because fire is a very heterogeneous process, and we're working in localized paleosol sediments. But there's also an order of magnitude increase in fire. So I think we can zoom in on these two records to try to ask the question of what the relationship between fire and C4 grasslands is through time. And when we do that and plot the alkane values on the x-axis and the PAH values on the y-axis, we can interrogate how these variables have changed on the landscape. So once again, this is on a log scale. So these samples are our youngest samples in the record, older than 10 million years ago, and they plot in this relatively depleted isotope space, relatively low fire space. If we move into our samples that are between 8 to 10 million years, we see there's a 5 times increase in fire inputs, but there's no subsequent increase in the isotopic values. If we move into our 6 to 10 million year space, moving into the C4 transition, what we see is that there's an increase in isotopic enrichment, but really no further shift in fire. And finally, if we move into these younger samples, so younger than 6 million years, we are moving into these fully open C4 ecosystems, and we get another order of magnitude increase in fire inputs in the record. So we see an increase in fire both before and with the expansion of these grassland systems. And if we do a basic Pearson's product correlation on these values, what we find is that despite the variability, the C4 inputs and fire inputs are very highly and significantly correlated in this record. So what do we think is happening here? So if we put this into our Fire Boomerang context, we can kind of classify what type of system we're seeing. So our oldest samples are in the retine values indicate we're in some type of system that had conifer inputs. PAHs indicate there's a low frequency fire system. If we move to this 8 to 10 million year transition, we see there's this 5 times increase in fire. but as we get a decrease in ret heat. So what I think is happening here is there's this fire-driven opening of landscapes occurring before we see any change in the isotopic shifts. And then finally, if we move into this fully C4 system where the isotopes indicate we're in a C4 grassland, the oxygen isotopes indicate we're in a summer seasonal system, and the fire concentrations indicate that we're getting a highly frequent fire system. So is there proxy evidence for fire feedback in late Miocene? I think that we can answer yes based on this data, but there's also evidence for this open C3 intermediate state, right? So we see this fire-driven opening of landscapes, which is potentially decreasing forest cover and either opening the landscape into either a C3 grassland or more of an open C3 shrubland. But what happens is once you get something that's going to favor the C4 photosynthetic pathway, like a summer monsoon, right? And this is based on that quantum yield model where if you have an increase in summer growing temperature, you're going to favor the C4 pathway over the C3 pathway. You then get this shift, which flips the system into this C4 system based on the metabolic constraints. And then these C4 grasses promote fire even more, combined with the promotion of seasonal drought, and you get these positive feedbacks that really maintain this open fire system. And we can even zoom on this more and ask, are these fires coming from combustion of C4 plants? And what a really cool tool that I'm just starting to get into now is that the carbon isotopes of these fire-derived compounds also reflect the differential fractionation between C3 and C4 plants, depending if they're coming from burned C3 plants or burned C4 plants. And this is just some data from the modern, and you can see not many people have measured these. There's a lot of work we still have to do to constrain this. But there's from the data that we do have, we see this differential fractionation. And so some work that I've been doing is measuring these same proxies in addition to the carbon isotopes of the pHs in Bengal fan sediments from the Asian subcontinent, the Indian subcontinent, to ask, is increasing fire frequency isotopically linked to C4 burning? And the better preservation in this record allows us to use this additional isotopic method. So when I put isotope values from pyrene, that pH I showed earlier from the Bengal fan, against these modern values, what we see is that they become increasingly enriched as we move through time, which seems to suggest that these fire compounds are coming from increasing burning of C4 grasslands. And if we put these into the context, so these are pH, the isotopic values of pHs through time, against the concentrations of pHs from the Bengal fan and the carbon isotopes of the alkanes from the Bengal fan, is we see that all of these are linked at that same time period that we see that transition happening in the Sewolics as well. So ultimately, I think the big takeaway from this work is that this molecular isotopic evidence indicates that frequent fire played an important role in both the opening of ancient grassland ecosystems and their continued maintenance through time. And we find this evidence in the South Asian record. And I just want to end with where I think this work really is going, is that we find evidence for this relationship strongly constrained in South Asia. But we know today that these grassland fire climate feedbacks differ in both their strength and character between different continents, very, very strongly in some cases. And I think that we need to explicitly measure if these paleo fire feedbacks are different on different continents with different evolutionary and climate histories in the Neogene as well. So I think that the tools that we've presented here are a really strong, useful toolbox to even interrogate some of these questions further in different continental contexts. So with that, I want to acknowledge the people that made this work possible, in particular my co-authors on the PNAS work in Sewolics, Kate Behrens-Meyer at the Smithsonian, and my advisor, Kate Freeman. And then the Bengal fan work has been in collaboration with Kevin Uno and Pradika Polazar at Lamont Doherty. And with that, I want to thank all of you for your attention today, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Questions for Allison?
Okay, so I'm one of these diehard holdouts that CO2 decline was the prime factor in causing the C4 expansion in the late Miocene. So do you see a role of carbon dioxide in any of this?
So I don't think that any of this contradicts that at all. I think I think there's this general, like, the way that I like to think about it is that a drop in CO2 was necessary, but not sufficient for grassland expansion. So you need that shift to have that metabolic preference potentially for C4, but it's not enough to trigger those individual events. And so there's something more local potentially happening in those regions. So I agree with you. Like, I think that a drop in CO2 still makes sense to have a role in the expansion, but I think that it's more complicated than just being driven by that drop in CO2. Yeah, necessary but not sufficient. I really think that fits what we know about the expansion. So.
Thanks very much, Allison. I enjoyed that. So I'm going to speak up for the mammals for a moment. Yeah. And I know from the Sewalik record that there's a very diverse group of ungulates. And I'm thinking of one of the papers you referenced, whose title I think is Fire as an Herbivore.
Yes.
What about the mammal? Or in other words, I guess I'm asking, is there some kind of interaction between the herbivorous mammals and the fire that could be either providing positive or negative feedbacks to any of this history?
Yeah, actually, I have a backup slide. So this is that feedback, fire feedback, with some of the ideas about grazing pressures added in. And yeah, so the interactions between fire and mammals as potential feedbacks in the late Miocene has definitely been acknowledged by the modelers, especially. I think it's even harder to test some of these feedbacks, but incorporating that on top of the fire knowledge is really important. In fact, like positive, right? So positive feedbacks in themselves sometimes are thought to be associated with like runaway feedbacks, and in states getting completely out of whack. And negative feedbacks are generally thought to be associated with stabilizing forces. So I think the herbivory component is thought to sometimes, to be a check on the force of fire and just completely converting the landscapes. And there's a paper that actually just came out this week, which talks about alternate stable states between fire-driven grasslands and grazing-driven, like lawn-driven grasslands. Yeah, we can talk about it later, which has this really interesting hysteresis feedback between the two different types of grassland states and a forest state. And so I think, and that's a modern paper thinking about these relationships in a modern context. And I think the more that we incorporate our modern understanding and try to explicitly test it with some of these new proxies, I think the more we're really going to get at some of these more small-scale interactions that are happening in these deeper time settings, these evolutionary contexts. So yeah, for sure.
Thank you, Alison. I wanted to ask you, before we get to the grasslands, you said about that the C3 forest was leading to a more C3 kind of open ecosystem, and you said that fire is driving that. And I wonder if you could maybe unpick for me some other possibilities, because I can't quite see how you would start with fire and end up in an open system.
So vegetation shifts in and of themselves can actually change, can change fire. It's almost like there's a propensity for, if there's a slight change in a vegetation state, to change a shift in fire without an external driver, almost an internal variability state. So I think that there's potential that something else could be happening besides a hydrologic shift, more of a ecological community-based shift, but I don't really have a great mechanism for that. We were more cautious about that part of the paper. We found evidence for it, but I think that we have to think a little bit more about how that's interacting with the feedbacks in itself. I think it's less well understood. And I think it's partially because these intermediate states are not as well understood in general in the modern either. But we're working on some interesting proxies we think can help us get at some of these more intermediate states and constrain them a little bit better. So to be continued for sure.
So yeah, I have similar questions about that. I was amazing to see that you were able to derive the photosynthetic pathways of burnt vegetation from like millions of years ago. That's incredible. But on the same lines, like I'm thinking that what is driving the dominance of these grasses? The fire opening up the habitat, or the grass is just outcompeting young seedlings, and then the fire comes with the grass?
Yeah.
And so, because there's, forested ecosystems like the Sierra Nevadas of California, those burn really frequently, but they're a C3 tree dominated system.
Yeah. Yeah. So there's definitely that's where the fire regime component comes in, right? That there are definitely exceptions to every rule. And like a really good example of two ecosystems you expect to have really similar fire regimes but don't are the conifer forests in Asia versus the conifer forests in Canada. They have, similar conifer plant functional types, but they burn very differently. And there's a lot of work that's been done to try to constrain, is this a climate-driven, is it an ecological-driven difference, is it a climate-driven difference? And I think that this idea, right, of testing what's actually driving that fire-vegetation interaction, I think it's unfortunately harder to say for sure in some of these deep time records. I think some of the modeling work has been really trying to get at that question. I think that's probably the way forward for some of those more specific connections that we can't explicitly measure. But I think also studying it in different places might enlighten us on what some of those drivers might be when we do observe differences. So.
Allison, that is a real tour de force. Thank you, and I think the insights, mechanistic insights, are really quite interesting. I do think there's a data set you might be interested in looking at, because I think it poses the opportunity to explore what Ben said and what I believe, and that's the Bogota Basin.
Okay.
Where you have about a 400,000-year record going in and out of the glacial and switching between C3 and C4 3 times. So if you don't have access to it, I would encourage you to try to get access to that, because I think it'll help address your question.
That's really cool. Yeah, I think that thinking about fire in the context of glacial or interglacial systems is also something that I'd be interested in starting to think about a little bit more as I finish up with the Miocene PhD and start to think about other applications for some of this. But yeah, I agree. And I think interrogating the relationship between these regional drivers and the global drivers too is something we as a community need to work more on. And I think it's an exciting frontier for the future. So.
You seem to imply the need for a strengthening monsoon in that period after you had the 10x increase in burning, but still no C4 indications. Yeah. And in that transition zone, say 8 to 6 million years or so ago, is there any evidence from marine cores for a strengthening Asian monsoon? Yeah,
so there's actually, the record we have in the Bengal fan, they did hydrogen isotopes on the leaf waxes, which is a proxy for paleohydrology as well. And they actually see a flickering during that period of time of enrichments, which we're still working on. I'm actually not a co-author on that work. That'll be coming out before my Bengal fan stuff comes out. But they think that there's some type of hydraulic flickering that's going on during that time, and that seems to line up really well with what we see with that C4 transition. So, yeah. I think that, yeah, there is. Short answer is there is. Yeah.
Any other questions for Allison? Okay, if not, you can grab her. We're at a break now.
Just so that people don't get too quiet and sleepy, we now have a 1-hour coffee break with poster session. So we have more than 20 posters out in the atrium. If you are thirsty or hungry for chocolate or other such things, please go back into room 1010 where you found food earlier. And then all the posters here are by folks from University of Michigan or a few of the visiting students from nearby universities, and many of them are highlighting the stable isotope research that goes on here in EEB, Earth Sciences, and Anthropology. So we'll see you back here at, don't want to trust these clocks, at 3:40 sharp, so that we can start with the last early career talk. Thanks again, Allison. Okay. And speakers and organizers, let's all cluster here. We need to gather again together for a photograph because we didn't have everybody last time.